And so, we step into the beginning of a life that would change the face of organized crime forever. She was born in Cartagena, Colombia, in 1943, a port city where the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and spice, where colonial sharp and insistent, before the sound was swallowed by the hum of a restless city. It was the 1970s and Medellín was alive with music, laughter, and whispers of deals being made, fortunes being built, and lives being gambled away. Within this city, where survival was a skill and violence was a language, there existed a presence that could chill a man's blood even in the heat of a Colombian night. Her name was Griselda Blanco, though soon the world would come to know her as the Cocaine Godmother. She was a woman who moved through the darkness with a kind of predatory grace, watching, waiting, always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Imagine her silhouette in those years, a woman of small frame but immense presence, her hair dark, her gaze unyielding. She was the kind of person who seemed to take up all the air in a room, even without speaking. To those who knew her, she was not merely another player in the game, she was the game itself. Her name inspired fear not because of what people knew she had done, but because of what they suspected she was capable of doing next. But this story does not begin at her peak. No, the tale of Griselda Blanco begins much earlier, in the shadows of poverty, on streets where the scent of danger mixed with the aroma of fried arepas and cheap liquor. Picture a young girl running barefoot through narrow alleys, her small hands quick to snatch anything of value, her eyes already holding the watchfulness of someone who understood that the world was not kind. She learned young that mercy was rare and that power belonged to those who were willing to take it. As the years passed, this girl would grow into a woman whose ambitions reached beyond the barriers of Medellín. She would leave behind the dusty streets of her childhood and step into the neonlit avenues of Miami, carrying with her not only her cunning but a vision of an empire built from white powder. It was a vision that would turn entire cities into battlefields, that would flood America with cocaine and leave a trail of blood in its wake. Even now, decades after her reign, there is a kind of mythic aura around her name. Some say she was brilliant, a criminal mastermind who outsmarted some of the most dangerous men in the world. Others say she was a monster, a woman whose thirst for power was matched only by her capacity for cruelty. The truth, as with most legends, lies somewhere in between. To understand Griselda, one must first understand the world that shaped her. Medellín was a city of contrasts, of music and machetes, of dancing and death. In the daylight, the markets overflowed with color and sound, vendors shouting over one another, children weaving through the crowds. But when night fell, the city belonged to another kind of crowd, smugglers, killers, dreamers who made their living in the shadows. It was here that the young Griselda absorbed her first lessons about survival: never appear weak, never hesitate, and never forgive an insult. The wind carried stories then, rumors that moved from bar to bar, whispered over bottles of aguardiente. Stories of a girl who was fearless, who would pull a knife as quickly as she would smile. These rumors were both warning and promise. They painted the outline of a figure who would one day be far more than just another street criminal. And yet, for all her ruthlessness, there was something almost poetic in her rise, the way she turned adversity into opportunity, the way she built an empire out of nothing but nerve and vision. Her life would become a tale of contradictions, a mother who could order a killing while holding a child in her arms, a businesswoman who combined elegance with savagery. As you lie back and listen to this story, imagine the rhythm of the city that shaped her, the distant hum of motorcycles, the occasional gunshot, the laughter that could turn to screams in an instant. This is not merely a tale of crime, it is the story of a world where survival demanded cunning, where loyalty was fleeting, and where power could be bought with blood. This journey will take you through the slums of Medellín, across the ocean to Miami during the cocaine boom, and into the courtrooms and prisons that eventually became her cage. You will see her rise from a child of the streets to a queen of a multimillion-dollar empire, and you will watch as paranoia and betrayal brought that empire crashing down. But for now, let the story begin slowly, like the first notes of a haunting melody. Let the images take shape, the crowded streets, the glittering Miami skyline, the tense faces of men who feared a woman more than they feared each other. The legend of Griselda Blanco is not just a chronicle of crime, it is a mirror reflecting the hunger, ambition, and darkness that exist in all who dare to reach too high. What happened next would shock even those who thought they had seen everything. And so, we step into the beginning of a life that would change the face of organized crime forever. She was born in Cartagena, Colombia, in 1943, a port city where the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and spice, where colonial buildings stood as relics of an old world. But for Griselda, there was no romance in Cartagena's charm. Her childhood was marked by poverty so deep that every day felt like a fight for scraps of survival. When she was still very young, her family moved to Medellín, a city that was growing rapidly, its neighborhoods swelling with migrants searching for work. What they found instead were shantytowns, makeshift homes made of tin and wood clinging to the hillsides like desperate hands holding on for dear life. Picture the environment that raised her: narrow alleys where stray dogs scavenged through trash piles, barefoot children with hungry eyes, and the ever-present tension of violence just around the corner. These were the formative years of the girl who would one day be called the Cocaine Godmother. Every sight, every sound, every lesson from the streets was molding her into someone who would never again allow herself to be powerless. Her father was mostly absent, and her mother struggled to keep the family afloat. Griselda grew up learning that there was no safety net, no one coming to save her. Food was scarce, and the little she had was fought for fiercely. In the barrios, children matured quickly. Games were not simply games, they were rehearsals for survival. Arguments often ended not in shouting but in knives being drawn. It was here, in this crucible of hardship, that Griselda's character began to take shape. She was small but quick, and she learned to defend herself early. Locals would later recall that even as a girl, she had a certain presence, an intensity in her eyes that unnerved people. She didn't shy away from conflict, she leaned into it. Stories from her childhood blur the line between fact and legend, but they all carry the same tone: she was fearless, cunning, and willing to do whatever it took. One tale that has followed her for decades tells of a kidnapping she orchestrated as a young teenager, abducting a boy from a wealthy family and demanding ransom. According to the story, when the family failed to pay, she is said to have killed the boy herself. Whether this tale is truth or myth, it paints a picture of a girl who was already willing to cross moral lines most adults would not dare approach. In those days, Medellín was not yet the global symbol of cartel violence it would become, but crime was already part of the city's heartbeat. Smuggling routes existed long before cocaine became the commodity of choice, and the neighborhoods where Griselda lived were familiar with black markets and contraband. From a young age, she saw that those who controlled these illicit trades were the ones with power, the ones who could walk through the streets without fear, the ones who could buy food, guns, and loyalty. Griselda began to carve out her own path in this world. She started small, pickpocketing, hustling, finding ways to get by. She ran with other kids who were just as desperate and just as hungry. Together they stole from vendors, slipped into homes, and sold whatever they could get their hands on. But even in this early stage, there was something about her that set her apart. While others were content to score enough to eat for the day, she thought bigger. By her mid-teens, she had graduated from petty theft to more daring schemes. She learned to charm, to manipulate, to read people, skills that would later become some of her deadliest weapons. The slums had taught her that people were predictable when you knew their fears and desires. She learned when to threaten and when to persuade, when to offer a smile and when to show teeth. As she moved through adolescence, her reputation began to grow. Some saw her as dangerous, others as magnetic. Friends and enemies alike began to realize that this young woman had ambitions that stretched far beyond their neighborhood. She did not want to simply survive, she wanted to dominate. Her relationships in these years also began to shape her future. She became involved with men older than herself, men who were connected to Medellin's criminal underbelly. Through them, she learned the mechanics of smuggling, of bribery, of moving goods unseen by the authorities. These early partnerships were transactional, stepping stones that allowed her to gather knowledge and position herself closer to the power she craved. At the same time, she bore witness to a reality that would stay with her forever: life in the streets was cheap. Friends would vanish, killed in fights or by the police, and their absence would be met with little more than a shrug. Death was a part of daily life, something to be expected rather than feared. For Griselda, this normalization of death removed one of the greatest barriers that keeps most people from crossing into a life of crime. If life could be taken so easily, why should it be sacred? And yet, despite the brutality of her environment, there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, where she saw what a different life might look like. She would pass by the wealthy districts of Medellín, see the women in fine dresses stepping out of cars, smell the perfume that clung to them like another skin. These sights lit a fire in her, not of envy, but of resolve. She would not die poor. She would not remain invisible. She would not be one of the nameless children lost to the streets. By the time she reached adulthood, she had already made a name for herself in her small corner of Medellín. Those who crossed her learned quickly that she was not to be underestimated. She was willing to fight, to steal, and, if necessary, to kill. She had carved out a place for herself where others had been swallowed by the streets. This chapter of her life was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. It was here, in the back alleys and hillside slums, that she discovered her appetite for control, her comfort with violence, and her talent for strategy. These were not just survival skills, they were the tools of an empire waiting to be forged. Soon, she would marry for the first time. Soon, her ambitions would outgrow Medellín itself, and she would set her sights on bigger markets, bigger risks, and bigger rewards. The young girl from the slums was about to become a woman whose name would one day terrify an entire continent. And as the streets of Medellín buzzed with the usual chaos, music playing, arguments spilling into the night, police sirens wailing, no one could yet imagine that one of the most notorious criminal figures of the 20th century was walking among them, already plotting the path that would take her from these hillsides to the throne of a bloody empire. Griselda's transition from a hardened street girl to a true criminal in the making came quietly, like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. The slums had already taught her that taking what you needed was not a crime, it was survival. But now, as she entered her late teens and early 20s, survival was no longer enough. She wanted control. She wanted respect. And she wanted fear, the kind of fear that cleared her path before she ever had to raise her hand. It began, as many things in her life did, with theft. Pickpocketing had been a childhood game, but now she and her crew planned robberies with precision. They targeted wealthy neighborhoods, ambushed drunks leaving cantinas, and sometimes hijacked trucks carrying goods into the city. For Griselda, every heist was more than money, it was a test. A test of courage, a test of planning, and a test of loyalty. Those who worked with her learned quickly that failure was not an option. But theft alone could not satisfy her ambition. Crime in Medellín was layered and organized, and the real power lay with those who moved contraband on a larger scale: cigarettes, liquor, jewelry, and later, narcotics. Griselda began to seek out opportunities that would elevate her above the level of petty street crime. Through lovers, friends, and criminal contacts, she entered the world of smuggling, a world where risk and reward grew in equal measure. By now, she had already learned the value of keeping her circle small. Trust was rare, and betrayal was common. Those who crossed her, even in small ways, often found themselves on the receiving end of her wrath. It was here that her reputation for violence began to solidify. If someone stole from her, she made an example of them. If someone betrayed her, she made sure no one forgot the price of disloyalty. Whispers spread through the underworld about the young woman who could order a killing without flinching. Her ruthlessness was not loud or showy, it was quiet, deliberate, and chilling. She understood instinctively what many men twice her age never grasped, that fear was the most reliable currency in a dangerous world. Fear kept people loyal when money ran out. Fear made them follow orders when greed might tempt them to stray. One of her earliest and most defining partnerships came when she met Carlos Trujillo, her first husband. Carlos was older and already involved in low-level smuggling operations. Together, they became a formidable pair, running scams and moving stolen goods. Their home life was far from conventional. It was more of a business arrangement than a romance, a partnership built on shared ambition and a mutual understanding of the streets. Carlos introduced her to a network of contacts, teaching her the logistics of moving illicit merchandise. But soon, Griselda began to outgrow him. She was more daring, more cunning, and less patient. Where Carlos preferred to play small and steady, Griselda wanted to expand, to risk more for greater profit. Their relationship became strained, with Griselda slowly becoming the dominant partner, the one who called the shots. This was also the period when she began to experiment with something that would later define her empire: ingenuity in crime. She designed new ways to hide merchandise, using hollowed-out furniture, sewn compartments in clothing, and other creative methods to move goods past checkpoints. Her mind never stopped working, always searching for the angle others had overlooked. But the streets had a way of reminding everyone that power was temporary. Rivals began to notice her rising influence, and threats became more frequent. There were confrontations, some ended in blood. Whether by her own hand or through others, Griselda was rumored to have been involved in multiple killings during these years. Each one added to her growing legend. To the outside world, she was still just another figure in Medellín's underworld, but within her circle, she was already something more, a leader, a strategist, a force. Even the men she worked with recognized that she had a vision none of them possessed. She wasn't thinking about the next job, or the next week, or even the next month. She was thinking years ahead. And then came the moment that would set her on the path toward international crime, the first steps into narcotics trafficking. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, cocaine was becoming the new gold in Colombia. At first, it was small shipments, a luxury product smuggled for the rich and powerful. Griselda saw its potential immediately. Cocaine was compact, easy to transport, and wildly profitable. Unlike stolen jewelry or contraband liquor, cocaine did not just sell, it created demand that kept customers coming back for more. Her operations began to shift. She still engaged in smuggling other goods, but increasingly, the focus turned to moving cocaine. This was risky, the penalties were harsher, the police more aggressive, but the profits were irresistible. A single successful shipment could make more money than months of smaller scams. As she entered this new chapter, her personality hardened further. She became more secretive, more selective about who she trusted. Her inner circle was loyal, but not out of love, out of fear and respect. To them, she was both protector and threat, the one who could elevate them to wealth or have them eliminated without hesitation. Even in these early days, there was something theatrical about Griselda's approach to power. She understood that reputation was a weapon, and she cultivated hers carefully. People needed to believe she was capable of anything, that no slight would go unanswered. Over time, the myth of Griselda Blanco began to grow beyond the reality, and she encouraged it. But this was only the beginning. The money was good, but Medellín was small. The real fortune, she knew, lay not in Colombia but in the United States, in the hungry, growing market of cities like New York and Miami, where cocaine was becoming the drug of choice for the rich and restless. The thought of those cities consumed her imagination. The slums had been her training ground, but she was ready for a bigger stage. Soon, she would leave behind the streets that had raised her. Soon, she would cross oceans and borders, taking with her not just cocaine but the cold, calculated ruthlessness that had already made her feared. And when she arrived, the United States would never be the same. For now, though, picture her standing on a Medellín hillside at dusk, the city lights beginning to twinkle below, her mind already miles away. She is thinking not about the next theft or the next deal, but about the empire she will one day build. An empire of powder and blood. Marriage, for Griselda Blanco, was never just about love, it was about leverage, about partnership, about creating the foundation she needed for the life she envisioned. Her first marriage to Carlos Trujillo came at a time when she was still carving out her place in Medellín's criminal hierarchy. To the outside world, they might have seemed like a mismatched pair, Carlos, older, more cautious, a man who preferred the steady rhythm of low-level smuggling, Griselda, younger, fiery, already looking far beyond the city limits. But together, they became a team and soon, more than a team. Their small home doubled as a planning hub. Picture the scene, a dimly lit room with maps spread across the table, cigarette smoke curling in the air, whispered conversations about routes, contacts, and payoffs. Carlos would explain the logistics of moving stolen appliances or liquor. Griselda would listen, nodding, then push for bolder moves. Where he saw risk, she saw opportunity. Where he hesitated, she pressed forward. It was not long before Griselda became the driving force behind their operations. She expanded their network, recruited new people, and began to create systems that made their smuggling more efficient. Her reputation as a planner and strategist grew. She was the one who figured out how to move merchandise without alerting police, how to bribe the right officials, and how to make sure her crew stayed loyal. But there was a tension in their partnership. Carlos was comfortable with the life they had: modest profits, limited exposure, staying under the radar. Griselda was restless. She wanted more money, more power, and more respect. She began to clash with Carlos over the direction of their business. In her mind, there was no point in playing small when the stakes were so high. During these years, Griselda also began to display the traits that would later make her feared as a cartel boss. She was ruthless when it came to enforcing discipline. If a member of their crew was caught skimming profits or betraying them, she acted swiftly. Loyalty was not a request, it was a demand. Carlos sometimes urged caution, but Griselda believed that any sign of weakness would invite disaster. She made examples of those who crossed her, and soon their crew operated under an unspoken rule: disobedience could mean death. It was also during this time that she began experimenting with more creative forms of smuggling, techniques that would one day revolutionize the trade. She realized that the key to moving contraband successfully was invisibility. So she began sewing hidden compartments into clothing, turning brass, girdles, and shoes into perfect vessels for concealing small but valuable cargo. Later, these methods would allow her to move cocaine into the United States in ways that authorities could not anticipate. But marriage to Carlos was not destined to last. Some say she grew tired of his lack of ambition, others that he became a liability, careless, too slow to adapt. What is clear is that their partnership eventually soared, and their marriage ended in divorce. Some rumors claim that Carlos met a darker fate, that Griselda had him killed when he ceased to be useful. Whether true or not, the story added to her reputation. She was not a woman to cross, not even for those who once shared her bed. After Carlos, she entered into another marriage, this time with Alberto Brevo, a man who would become her true partner in crime, and the one who would help her make the leap from Medellín street smuggler to international drug trafficker. With Alberto, her operations grew significantly more sophisticated. They were no longer just moving stolen goods or small shipments, they were beginning to move cocaine in quantities that hinted at what was to come. This was the period when Griselda's vision of an empire truly began to take shape. She was not content with being a player in Medellín's underworld, she wanted to dominate it, and beyond that, to control the flow of cocaine into the most lucrative markets in the world. She and Alberto began to build connections with suppliers, corrupt officials, and transporters who could move their product out of Colombia and into the United States. The risks grew greater, but so did the rewards. Each successful shipment brought in more money than she had ever seen before. Cash began to pile up in drawers, in closets, under floorboards. She bought better clothes, better furniture, better everything. But this was not just indulgence. To her, these luxuries were symbols, proof that she was no longer the barefoot girl from the slums. She was becoming someone powerful, someone to be reckoned with. And yet, beneath the surface of this growing wealth, there was always danger. Rivals watched her rise with suspicion. Police raids became more frequent. Brides grew more expensive. The tension never let up. But Griselda thrived in this pressure cooker. The more dangerous the game became, the sharper her mind seemed to grow. She was always 2 steps ahead, always planning, always calculating. This period of her life was both a personal and professional metamorphosis. She shed the last remnants of her old life, the timidness, the hesitations, and embraced fully the identity of a criminal leader. She was no longer merely surviving. She was building something that would outlast her, something that would one day be spoken of in the same breath as the most powerful cartels in history. Her eyes were already turning northward, to the glittering promise of the United States, especially Miami, where the cocaine trade was just beginning to explode. Miami was different from Medellín. It was a place where luxury was flaunted, where money moved fast, and where authorities were still trying to understand the scale of what was coming. To Griselda, Miami was not just an opportunity, it was destiny. Soon, she would make the move that would change everything. She would leave Colombia behind and take her place on the stage of international crime. And when she did, she would unleash a wave of violence and power that would transform Miami into the cocaine capital of the world. For now, though, imagine her sitting in that Medellín home, counting stacks of money by candlelight, her mind already racing ahead to the next big move. Alberto Bravo by her side, plans being whispered into the night, dreams of planes, boats, and cash-laden streets in a faraway city. The queen was almost ready to claim her throne. The decision to leave Colombia was not made lightly, but for Griselda Blanco, the choice felt inevitable. Medellín had given her everything, the grit, the cunning, the lessons of survival, but it had also become too small for her ambitions. The United States was where the real money flowed, where cocaine was quickly becoming the drug of choice for wealthy partygoers, nightclubs, and celebrities. And among the cities that glittered with opportunity, one stood out above all others, Miami. In the early 1970s, Miami was a city in transition, a sunlit paradise on the surface, with palm trees swaying gently and waves breaking along golden beaches, but also a city whose underbelly was beginning to pulse with new currents of vice. Tourists came for the warmth and the nightlife, but increasingly, they also came for the drugs. Marijuana and heroin had already made their mark, but cocaine was different. Cocaine was clean, glamorous, and seductive, the perfect companion to disco nights and champagne mornings. Griselda saw the potential with clarity that few others possessed. She knew that if she could establish a pipeline between Medellín and Miami, she could flood the city with cocaine and corner the market before her rivals understood what was happening. And so, she and her partner Alberto Bravo made their move, leaving Colombia behind and settling in Florida. Picture the moment they arrived, the humid air of Miami wrapping around them, the sound of Spanish and English mingling in the streets, the ocean breeze carrying the promise of something vast and dangerous. For Griselda, this was not just a relocation, this was a conquest waiting to happen. At first, the operation was small. She tested the waters, sending modest shipments hidden in cleverly designed clothing, household items, and even children's toys. Each successful run was a rush, not just for the money but for the proof that her system worked. Soon, she began to scale up, sending more product, recruiting more couriers, and building a network of distribution that spread through Miami like roots under the soil. Her ingenuity was unmatched. She famously designed lingerie with secret compartments capable of carrying several kilos of cocaine, turning ordinary women into walking smuggling devices. These mules were paid well, but they were also carefully chosen and closely monitored. Griselda understood that the key to success was minimizing risk, and risk, in her world, meant loose ends. Each shipment brought back more cash than the last. The money piled up so quickly that they struggled to launder it fast enough. Miami banks, still naive to the scale of what was happening, accepted huge deposits without asking too many questions. Cash moved through real estate, through car dealerships, through nightclubs, always in a race to stay ahead of the authorities' suspicion. But Griselda's rise in Miami was not without friction. The city already had its share of criminal players, from Cuban smugglers to local gangs, and not everyone was happy about a Colombian woman muscling into their territory. At first, some underestimated her. They saw her as just another trafficker, perhaps easier to deal with because she was a woman. But those who tested her resolve quickly learned that she was as dangerous as any man, perhaps more so. When rivals tried to undercut her or steal from her, she responded with lethal precision. She ordered hits without hesitation, sending a message to anyone who thought they could cross her. Miami had seen violence before, but the kind of violence Griselda unleashed was on another level, calculated, public, and terrifyingly effective. The authorities, too, began to take notice. Cocaine seizures started to rise, and law enforcement realized that something was happening in their city that was bigger than anything they had seen before. The DEA began monitoring shipments, watching the sudden influx of Colombian immigrants with suspicion and piecing together the outlines of what would later become known as the Medellín Cartel network. But for the time being, Griselda was untouchable. Her methods were too clever, her network too loyal, her reach too wide. She became a ghost that law enforcement could never quite catch, always slipping through their fingers at the last moment. And while the authorities were scrambling to understand the scale of the problem, she was already moving more product, expanding her reach, and raking in millions. By the mid-1970s, Miami was beginning to change. Cocaine was no longer just a luxury drug, it was becoming mainstream. Nightclubs buzzed with the energy of partygoers whose nights stretched until dawn, fueled by the white powder that flowed so freely. The money was intoxicating. Griselda and Alberto bought houses, cars, jewelry. They threw parties that were extravagant but never careless. She knew that every display of wealth had to be balanced with caution. And yet, the more successful she became, the more dangerous the game became. Rivals were growing restless, authorities were getting closer, and every shipment carried the risk of disaster. Griselda's paranoia began to grow. She trusted fewer and fewer people, relying on a tight circle of lieutenants to manage her operations. She was careful, but she was also bold, willing to take risks that others might have avoided because for her, failure was simply not an option. Miami was becoming her city, but it was also becoming a powder keg. The streets were filling with money, cocaine, and guns, and sooner or later, something would ignite the explosion that would come to define the era. Griselda Blanco was at the heart of it, orchestrating a symphony of crime that would turn Miami into a battlefield and make her name legendary. For now, though, imagine her sitting by a window in her Miami home, looking out at the neon lights reflecting on wet streets after a summer storm. She is calm, collected, already planning the next shipment, the next move, the next step toward cementing her reign. The Cocaine Godmother was no longer just a dream in Medellín, she was becoming a reality, and Miami had no idea what was about to hit it. What came next would turn the city into something unrecognizable. Blood would run in the streets, headlines would scream of massacres in broad daylight, and the very culture of Miami would be reshaped by the empire Griselda was building. The cocaine boom was no longer just beginning, it was about to explode. The mid-1970s were a turning point for Griselda Blanco. Miami had welcomed her quietly at first, but now the city was learning to fear her name. The early shipments had been just the beginning, small test runs that proved her system worked. Now she was scaling up, turning a profitable hustle into a sprawling enterprise. Griselda was not just a smuggler, she was an innovator. To her, smuggling was an art form, and she treated it with the same care a painter gives a canvas. She obsessed over the details, the routes, the couriers, the timing. Every shipment was planned with precision. She created what many would later call the first sophisticated cocaine smuggling network between Colombia and the United States, a network so efficient it would serve as a blueprint for others long after her reign ended. One of her most brilliant innovations was the use of specially designed undergarments to transport cocaine. She hired seamstresses to sew hidden compartments into bras, girdles, and underwear, allowing couriers to carry several kilos of cocaine on their bodies without detection. Women became the backbone of her smuggling operation, ordinary-looking housewives, secretaries, and girlfriends who could pass through airports without arousing suspicion. But she did not stop there. Griselda diversified her methods, using hollowed-out suitcases, car panels, and even children's toys to conceal product. She recruited pilots to fly small planes loaded with cocaine, landing on clandestine airstrips in Florida's swamps. She used boats that could slip in and out of Miami's marinas under the cover of darkness. Every route, every strategy, was carefully calculated. If one method was compromised, she already had another ready to deploy. Her operation became a machine, smooth, relentless, and astonishingly profitable. Each week, millions of dollars in cocaine flowed into Miami, and each week, mountains of cash flowed back to Colombia. At its peak, her network was reportedly moving hundreds of kilos at a time, generating profits that seemed almost impossible to count. The money created both power and vulnerability. Griselda had to find ways to launder the cash without attracting too much attention. She invested in real estate, nightclubs, and legitimate businesses, but there was simply too much money to hide. Suitcases of cash piled up in houses, closets, even under beds. Some say she bought expensive furniture just so she could stuff it with rolled-up bills. With this wealth came the need for control. Smuggling on such a scale required an army of loyal workers, pilots, mules, drivers, enforcers, accountants. Griselda became the undisputed general of this army. She was charismatic but terrifying, capable of warmth one moment and icy wrath the next. Those who worked for her knew that loyalty was rewarded handsomely, but betrayal was punished with merciless finality. Fear became the invisible glue that held her empire together. If someone stole from her, she made sure they paid dearly. If someone disobeyed an order, they disappeared. Her reputation spread quickly, not just in Miami, but back in Colombia, where young traffickers spoke her name with a mix of awe and dread. There were stories of her sitting calmly at a table, sipping coffee, as she gave the order for someone to be killed. Stories of her sending assassins on motorcycles, sicarios, to gun down rivals in broad daylight. Whether all these stories were true or embellished hardly mattered. In the criminal underworld, reputation was often more powerful than reality, and Griselda's reputation became a weapon she wielded expertly. She also understood the importance of loyalty within her own family. Her sons became involved in the business, learning the trade under her watchful eye. She was fiercely protective of them, and many believe that some of her most brutal decisions were motivated by her desire to keep her children safe and in power. Yet even as her empire grew, so did her paranoia. Success in the cocaine trade was a double-edged sword. The more product she moved, the more attention she attracted. Rival traffickers saw an opportunity to take her down and seize her routes. Law enforcement, both in the United States and Colombia, began to recognize that she was not just another smuggler but one of the key figures driving the cocaine epidemic. Griselda responded to these pressures by tightening her grip even further. She became more selective about who she allowed into her circle, more ruthless in eliminating threats. It was during this period that she is said to have personally overseen or ordered dozens of murders, creating a climate of terror that kept both her enemies and her own crew in check. But alongside the violence was a strange, almost regal sense of style. Griselda carried herself like a queen, impeccably dressed, always in control. She was known to host gatherings where business was discussed over fine food and drink, but the undertone was always clear: she was the one in charge, and dissent was not tolerated. Miami, meanwhile, was changing rapidly under the weight of the cocaine boom. The city's crime rate skyrocketed, hospitals saw a surge in overdose cases, and so much money, flowed into the local economy that it began to warp everything it touched. Nightclubs were packed, flashy cars lined the streets, and developers built luxury condos with cash whose origins were never questioned. Griselda's hand was in much of this transformation. Her network fed the city's hunger for cocaine, and in return, Miami became the perfect stage for her rise. But the city was also becoming volatile, a place where disputes between rival traffickers were settled with bullets instead of words. For the moment, though, Griselda was at the height of her power. Her smuggling innovations had given her an advantage that few could match, and her combination of cunning, brutality, and vision made her nearly untouchable. She was no longer just a smuggler, she was an architect of one of the most efficient drug distribution systems the world had ever seen. But this level of power could not remain hidden forever. The authorities were watching, her rivals were plotting, and the streets were growing restless. The next phase of her story would not be just about building an empire, it would be about defending it at any cost. And soon, Miami would explode into open warfare. The cocaine cowboys era was about to begin, and Griselda Blanco would stand at the very center of the storm. Miami in the late 1970s was no longer the quiet coastal city it once had been. The palm trees still swayed, the beaches still gleamed under the Florida sun, but something had shifted. The air was heavier now, charged with tension, as if the city itself knew that it was sitting on a powder keg. And in many ways, it was a literal and figurative one, built on kilos of cocaine that poured in week after week. Griselda Blanco was no longer operating in the shadows. Her network had grown into something formidable, a machine that moved cocaine with ruthless efficiency. Every successful shipment brought not just profit, but power that Griselda used to cement her place as the undisputed queen of Miami's drug trade. But with power came war. The demand for cocaine was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. Nightclubs, country clubs, and high-rise apartments bust with the white powder that seemed to touch every part of Miami's social scene. But where there is demand, there is competition. Rival traffickers, Cuban gangs, and independent dealers all wanted a piece of the fortune that flowed through the city. And Griselda had no intention of sharing. The first major sparks flew when some of her product was stolen, either hijacked en route or skimmed from the distribution network. In Griselda's world, theft was unforgivable. She responded swiftly, sending her enforcers, the infamous sicarios, to hunt down those responsible. And they did not merely kill, they made examples. Bodies were left in cars, in parking lots, in alleys, as grim reminders that stealing from the godmother meant death. Then came the moment that would cement Miami's descent into the era now known as the cocaine cowboy years, the Dadeland Mall massacre. It was 11th July 1979, a hot summer day, when two men walked into Crown Liquors inside the Dadeland Mall with Mac-10 machine guns and opened fire. The victims were alleged rivals of Griselda, gunned down in a public space in broad daylight. The attackers sprayed bullets with terrifying precision, leaving behind a scene of carnage that stunned the city. This was not the kind of crime Miami was used to. This was something new, something brazen, theatrical, and horrifyingly efficient. Newspapers splashed the story across their front pages. Law enforcement agencies scrambled to respond. For ordinary citizens, it was a wake-up call that Miami had changed. Violence was no longer hidden in dark alleys, it had spilled into the open. And Griselda? She remained untouchable, insulated by layers of lieutenants and loyal soldiers. The whispers in the underworld said she had ordered the hit personally, that it was her message to anyone who thought about challenging her control. Whether or not she pulled the trigger figuratively or literally mattered little, the message had been received. From that moment on, the streets of Miami became a battlefield. Daylight shootouts became frighteningly common. Cars were sprayed with bullets as they rolled through busy intersections. Drug warehouses were raided not just by police, but by rival crews looking to steal shipments. The murder rate skyrocketed, and many of those murders bore the hallmarks of Griselda's ruthlessness. Her organization operated like a cartel long before that word became infamous. She had suppliers, distributors, hitmen, and accountants, all working in a hierarchy that reported directly to her. She ruled with a mixture of fear and reward. Those who were loyal lived well, those who disobeyed often did not live long. Miami's nightlife became both the stage and the backdrop for her empire. Imagine a nightclub in 1979, the music loud, the air thick with cigarette smoke and perfume, wealthy men in open shirts dancing with women draped in gold jewelry. In the VIP sections, deals were made, money was exchanged, and cocaine was laid out on mirrored tables under the glow of neon lights. And somewhere, perhaps watching from a quiet corner, was one of Griselda's trusted lieutenants, keeping an eye on business. The violence did not scare away demand, if anything, it seemed to increase it. Cocaine had become a status symbol, a sign that you had arrived, that you belonged to the fast and glamorous world of Miami's elite. And as long as demand stayed high, Griselda's network thrived. But beneath the glitter and excess, paranoia was spreading. Griselda herself became more isolated, trusting fewer and fewer people. She was said to sleep with multiple bodyguards nearby, and she rotated safe houses to avoid assassination attempts. The same fear she inspired in others began to creep into her own life. Her enemies were multiplying. Rival Colombian traffickers wanted to cut her out of the business. Cuban gangs wanted more territory. Even members of her own organization occasionally plotted against her, hoping to take over her empire. But each time, Griselda struck first. The list of her enemies grew shorter not because they gave up, but because they were dead. The authorities, meanwhile, were beginning to connect the dots. The DEA, the FBI, and local police all ramped up their efforts to bring her down. They raided stash houses, seized shipments, and arrested low-level members of her crew, trying to flip them as informants. But Griselda's network was tightly controlled, and her people were often too terrified to betray her. Miami was changing. The city that had once been known for beaches and retirees was now known for cocaine and bloodshed. Reporters began to call it the drug capital of the United States, and headlines warned of a new kind of criminal empire, one that seemed impossible to stop. Through it all, Griselda remained a shadowy figure, feared, whispered about, but rarely seen. When she did appear in public, she was always composed, always in control, her presence enough to silence a room. She was the queen at the center of the chaos, the calm eye of the storm. And yet, even at this height of power, the cracks were beginning to form. The more violent Miami became, the more resources law enforcement devoted to dismantling the networks that fueled it. Griselda's brilliance and brutality had brought her to the top, but the same ferocity that made her feared was also painting a target on her back. For now, though, imagine Miami under her rule, a city of bright lights and dark alleys, of music and machine guns, of glamour and fear. Every street corner, every nightclub, every bank felt her influence. She was not just running a business, she was running a kingdom built on white powder, and for the moment, no one dared challenge the throne. But the storm was only growing louder. The next chapter of her story would see her tighten her grip even further, ruling through sheer terror even as the walls slowly began to close around her. At the height of her power, Griselda Blanco was more than a smuggler, more than a trafficker, she was a ruler. Her empire stretched from the jungles of Colombia to the sun-drenched streets of Miami, and everywhere in between. Her name inspired a visceral reaction. To some, she was a benefactor, a source of wealth and opportunity. To others, she was a ghost of death that could appear at any moment, no matter how far they ran. Fear was her currency. It was what kept her operation disciplined, what kept her lieutenants in line, what kept rivals awake at night. And Griselda understood this better than anyone. She didn't just enforce loyalty, she cultivated an aura, a myth, that made people fear her even when she wasn't there. Her punishments were swift and merciless. If she suspected betrayal, she acted immediately, often without giving the accused a chance to explain. Those who defied her orders were gunned down in the streets, their deaths meant as lessons to everyone else. Miami became littered with these lessons, bodies slumped behind the wheel of cars, riddled with bullets, news anchors grimly reporting yet another drug-related homicide. The image of her as a woman capable of ordering death without hesitation only made her more formidable. In a world dominated by men, she proved that she could be more ruthless, more cunning, and more dangerous than any of them. It was said that she would attend business meetings where hardened traffickers, men responsible for dozens of murders themselves, would lower their voices when she spoke. Her system of control was simple: reward those who served well, destroy those who didn't. She paid her people generously, gave them cars, apartments, even protection for their families. But the price of betrayal was non-negotiable. It didn't matter if you were a close associate, a lover, or even a family member. If you crossed her, you were finished. Despite her ferocity, Griselda was also known to be deeply involved in the personal lives of those in her inner circle. She played godmother to their children, attended their parties, and in some cases even treated them as extended family. This made her betrayals feel even colder, even more shocking, because they came from someone who could smile at you one day and order your death the next. Paranoia became her constant companion. The more powerful she became, the more convinced she was that everyone was plotting against her. She rotated her safe houses regularly, rarely sleeping in the same place 2 nights in a row. Bodyguards were posted at every entrance, and she traveled with convoys of armed men. The walls around her were both physical and psychological, fortresses meant to keep the outside world at bay. Even so, she was not a recluse. She still ventured into Miami's nightlife, appearing in clubs and restaurants, her presence impossible to ignore. When she walked in, conversations fell silent. There was a weight to her presence, as though everyone in the room could feel that death was only a word away. Her ruthlessness became legendary. There were stories of her ordering hits on enemies even while pregnant, of settling scores in ways so brutal that even other traffickers were shocked. Some claimed that she kept a blacklist of those who had wronged her, and that she would slowly work her way down that list, eliminating them one by one until no one was left. But Griselda's power was not just built on fear. She was, at her core, a brilliant strategist. She knew how to move product, how to manage supply chains, how to stay ahead of law enforcement. She adapted constantly, changing smuggling routes, rotating personnel, and finding new ways to disguise shipments. She was always evolving, always thinking several steps ahead. Her personal life, however, was often as chaotic as her business empire. Her relationships were turbulent, marked by passion, betrayal, and sometimes bloodshed. Lovers came and went, some dying under mysterious circumstances. Rumors swirled that even her second husband, Alberto Bravo, eventually fell victim to her wrath during a violent confrontation in Colombia, a shootout that left Bravo dead and Griselda wounded but alive. After Bravo's death, she became even more formidable. Now she was not just a partner in the business, she was the business. Every major decision passed through her. She was the architect, the executor, and the enforcer of her empire. Those who worked for her understood that there was no appeal, no higher authority. Her word was law. The city itself seemed to bend around her will. Nightclubs thrived on the money her trade brought in, car dealerships and jewelry stores flourished as traffickers spent their profits, and Miami's real estate market quietly soaked up cash from her organization. Yet at the same time, fear gripped the city. Parents warned their children to stay away from certain neighborhoods. Ordinary citizens avoided nightclubs known to be frequented by drug traffickers. The violence had become so common that locals grew numb to it, the sound of gunfire no longer startling. And through it all, Griselda remained calm outwardly, at least. She was in her prime, commanding millions of dollars in revenue every week, feared by enemies and respected by allies. But deep inside, she must have known that this level of power could not last forever. Miami was no longer just a city, it was a stage where her reign played out in full view of law enforcement and the press. Every assassination, every shootout, every whisper of her name only drew more attention. And though she was still untouchable, still too clever to be caught, the pressure was building. For now, though, imagine her at the peak of her empire, seated at the head of a lavish table in a Miami mansion, her lieutenants gathered around, the air thick with cigar smoke. She listens as they report on shipments, profits, rivals. She nods occasionally, speaks rarely, but when she does, her words carry the weight of life and death. This is Griselda Blanco, calm, calculating, and utterly in control, a queen who rules not by charm but by fear. But even queens cannot hold their thrones forever. The forces gathering against her, the rivals, the law, the betrayals yet to come were already moving into place. And soon, the bloodshed would intensify, and the godmother would be forced to fight not just for power, but for survival itself. Griselda Blanco's empire was unlike anything Miami had ever seen, and one of the most striking aspects of her rule was that it was led by a woman. In the world of organized crime, especially in the 1970s and early 1980s, the major players were almost exclusively men. Men ran the cartels. Men carried the guns. Men made the deals. And yet here was Griselda, a woman who not only entered that world but bent it to her will. Her gender was both a weapon and a challenge. On one hand, being underestimated worked in her favor. Many rivals, law enforcement officers, and even business partners initially dismissed her, assuming that she was merely a figurehead or that a man must have been pulling the strings behind her operation. They were wrong, and those who made that mistake rarely made it twice. Griselda used these assumptions to her advantage, playing into the image of being less threatening, more approachable, even maternal when it suited her. But the truth was, she was every bit as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than the men she dealt with. If they used fear to control their networks, she wielded fear like a scalpel, precise and deliberate. Being a woman in such a violent, male-dominated world also forced her to be more brutal than her counterparts. She could not afford to appear weak for even a moment. Every decision, every order, every public act had to reinforce the message that she was untouchable. Violence became not just a tool but a performance, a way of reminding everyone that her power was absolute. Some who knew her said that this need to assert herself made her even more ruthless than the men she competed with. She was not afraid to shed blood, not afraid to go to war, and not afraid to make examples of those who disrespected her authority. Stories circulated of her attending parties where someone who had crossed her would be dragged out and executed, their fate a chilling warning to everyone present. And yet, there was another side to Griselda, a paradoxical side that made her story even more complex. She could be fiercely protective, almost maternal, toward those she considered part of her inner circle. She gave lavish gifts, provided homes for her most trusted workers, and paid for their families to live comfortably. She acted as godmother to their children, a role she seemed to take seriously, even as she ordered hits on their enemies. This duality made her both terrifying and magnetic. People were drawn to her, not just out of fear but out of a strange sense of loyalty. Working for Griselda was dangerous, yes, but it was also rewarding. She inspired the kind of devotion that made people willing to die for her, and many did. But being a woman in this world also came at a cost. The constant need to prove herself weighed heavily on her. Paranoia gnawed at her edges, whispering that everyone was watching, waiting for her to slip, waiting for the moment they could take everything from her. Trust became a rare and precious commodity. She began to suspect even those closest to her, questioning their motives, their loyalty, their love. This suspicion often turned deadly. If she felt betrayed, she acted with lethal decisiveness. Even her lovers were not safe. Some say that the very men who once shared her bed later found themselves in her crosshairs, victims of her wrath when she believed they had turned against her. Love, for Griselda, was never separate from power. It was part of the same dangerous equation, and if the balance tipped, love could turn into death in an instant. Despite this, she cultivated an image that blended power and femininity in a way that fascinated many. She dressed elegantly, carried herself with confidence, and was known for her distinctive style. She could walk into a room full of hardened killers and command their attention without raising her voice. She became, in many ways, a mythic figure, the woman who ruled like a man but moved through the world with a unique charisma all her own. Outside of Miami, her legend began to spread. Newspapers and law enforcement reports painted her as the most powerful female drug lord in history. Television crews speculated about her operations, sometimes exaggerating the details until she became almost larger than life. In Colombia, her name was spoken with a mixture of pride and fear, pride that one of their own had risen so high, fear that her actions would bring more heat from the Americans. But with notoriety came exposure. The higher she climbed, the more visible she became. And the more visible she became, the more enemies she attracted. Rivals were no longer just local dealers or Cuban gangs, they were other Colombian traffickers, powerful men who saw her as a threat to their own ambitions. The male-dominated cartel hierarchy was not always willing to accept a woman as an equal, let alone a superior. So she fought back the only way she knew how, with blood. Each attempt to challenge her was met with swift retaliation. Her assassins became infamous for their precision, often arriving on motorcycles, gunning down targets, and disappearing into the Miami traffic before police could react. These killings became so common that the city gave them a name, motorcycle hits, and they became a signature of Griselda's reign. To outsiders, her life might have seemed glamorous, the mansions, the parties, the jewelry, the power. But beneath the surface, it was a life lived under constant threat, a life where every day could be the last. And yet, Griselda seemed to thrive in this environment, feeding off the tension, using it to sharpen her instincts and tighten her control. Imagine her during this period, sitting in a darkened room late at night, a glass of cognac in hand, listening to reports from her lieutenants. Her face calm, her voice measured, as she decides who will live and who will die. There is no hesitation, no second-guessing, just cold, clinical decisions that shape the fate of Miami's underworld. She was a woman who had forced her way into a man's world and claimed it as her own. But the cost of that conquest was high, and the enemies she had made were gathering strength. The next phase of her story would see her reach the peak of her wealth and influence, but it would also bring her closer to the edge of a downfall that no amount of power could prevent. At her peak, Griselda Blanco lived like royalty. Her rise from the slums of Medellín to the throne of Miami's cocaine trade was complete, and she ruled with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. The money that poured into her coffers each week was staggering, millions of dollars in cash arriving faster than it could be counted. There were days when the sheer volume of bills was so overwhelming that her crew resorted to stacking them in closets, stuffing them under beds, even hiding them in walls. Griselda invested her fortune in a way that reflected both her ambition and her taste for excess. She bought sprawling mansions in Miami's most exclusive neighborhoods, properties with marble floors, grand staircases, and crystal chandeliers that glimmered like captured stars. The driveways were lined with expensive cars, Mercedes-Benz sedans, Cadillac limousines, even custom-built sports cars that gleamed under the Florida sun. But her wealth was more than just material. It was symbolic. Every house, every car, every piece of jewelry was a testament to how far she had come, proof that the barefoot girl from Medellín had not only escaped poverty but conquered it. She wore her success like armor, a visible reminder to allies and enemies alike that she had risen to a level few could ever reach. Her personal style became iconic within her circle. She dressed in tailored clothes, wore heavy gold jewelry, and carried herself with a regal air that made even hardened killers lower their voices in her presence. At parties, she was often the center of attention, though she did not always seek the spotlight. She preferred to observe, to watch others, to measure their words and movements, always calculating, always thinking. These gatherings were not mere celebrations, they were power displays. The champagne flowed, the music thumped, and the air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive perfume. The guests were a mix of lieutenants, smugglers, and Miami's elite, politicians, businessmen, and nightclub owners who all benefited, directly or indirectly, from the fortune she poured into the city. Despite the luxury that surrounded her, Griselda's life was far from peaceful. Her empire required constant attention, and her paranoia had grown alongside her wealth. She knew that power was a double-edged sword. The higher she climbed, the more people wanted to pull her down. She slept with bodyguards stationed outside her door, her homes fortified like fortresses. Even her movements were carefully planned. She never stayed in the same place for too long, and she kept her travel patterns unpredictable. This paranoia extended to her personal relationships. Trust became a fragile, brittle thing. She suspected betrayal everywhere, among her employees, her friends, even her lovers. Some say she would test her closest associates by feeding them false information to see if it leaked. If it did, the punishment was swift and deadly. Griselda's reputation during this period was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous liability. People feared her so deeply that many refused to speak her name aloud, referring to her simply as La Madrina, the Godmother. But the same fear that kept her crew loyal also drew the attention of law enforcement. Each brazen act of violence, each daylight assassination, each flashy purchase made her a bigger target. And the violence did not stop. If anything, it escalated. The war for control of Miami's cocaine market raged on, and Griselda fought it with the same ruthless determination that had brought her to power. Her assassins struck with impunity, leaving behind scenes so shocking that even the media struggled to keep up. Newspapers reported the killings almost daily, their front pages filled with images of bullet-riddled cars and police officers standing over bodies. Yet, for all the bloodshed, Griselda remained calm, composed, almost detached. To her, violence was simply another cost of doing business. She viewed it as a tool, no different from an airplane or a smuggling route. If removing a rival required death, then death was delivered cleanly, efficiently, and without remorse. Her children, too, were growing up in this world of wealth and danger. She adored them, spoiled them, but also expected them to be part of her empire. They were taught the business, the rules, the code of loyalty that had kept her alive. But her love for them also became a weakness. Her enemies knew that targeting her family could destabilize her, and some were willing to exploit that vulnerability. The pressure from law enforcement intensified. The DEA had by now identified her as one of the key players in the influx of cocaine into the United States, and they were determined to take her down. Investigations multiplied, informants were cultivated, and surveillance teams tracked her movements. The walls were beginning to close in, even if she didn't yet realize how close they truly were. And still, the money came. Week after week, shipment after shipment, her fortune grew. Some estimates claimed she was earning as much as 80 million a month at her peak, a number so large it was almost unimaginable. She was arguably the wealthiest and most powerful drug trafficker in Miami at the time, rivaling even the emerging Medellín cartel bosses back in Colombia. But power built on fear is never truly secure. Even as she sat on her throne, Griselda must have sensed the fragility of her position. Enemies were everywhere, rivals plotting her death, police building their cases, even former allies looking for a chance to break free from her iron grip. The higher she climbed, the lonelier she became, surrounded not by friends but by people too afraid to leave. Imagine her at this moment, in one of her Miami mansions, the room dimly lit, the curtains drawn. The sound of the ocean drifts through the windows, but she barely notices. Her mind is busy, counting profits, reviewing shipments, deciding who can be trusted and who must be eliminated. She is at the peak of her empire, but also at the peak of her paranoia. The story of Griselda Blanco was now a story of extremes, extreme wealth, extreme power, and extreme violence. But the more extreme her world became, the closer she came to the point where it would all begin to collapse. And soon, the collapse would come. The enemies she had made, the violence she had unleashed, the attention she had drawn, all of it was converging. The queen of Miami's cocaine trade was about to learn that even the most feared rulers cannot escape the consequences of the kingdoms they build. By the early 1980s, the empire Griselda had built was running at full speed, shipments arriving weekly, cash flowing faster than it could be counted. But empires built on fear and bloodshed are never truly stable. The very qualities that had made Griselda unstoppable were now beginning to turn against her. Rivals were becoming bolder, authorities more determined, and paranoia gnawed at her like a constant shadow. Her reign had left behind a trail of bodies, and each one had made her a little more infamous. In the criminal world, this reputation kept her enemies in check, but it also made her a target. Every cartel, every rival smuggler, every independent dealer in Miami knew that if they could eliminate Griselda Blanco, they might claim a piece of the fortune she controlled. The violence escalated. Shootouts became more frequent, more public, more chaotic. Miami's streets were awash in blood as rival factions fought for control of territory and distribution networks. Drive-by shootings, car bombings, and daytime assassinations turned the city into what reporters called the most dangerous place in America. One of the most notorious incidents of this era was the infamous Dadeland Mall massacre, which had already sent shockwaves through the city, but now there were copycats, other traffickers settling disputes with similar public spectacles. The murder rate in Miami soared, and the media began using a new phrase to describe the chaos, the cocaine cowboy wars. Griselda remained at the center of it all. She responded to every attack, every challenge with overwhelming force. If a rival shot at one of her men, she would send a team to wipe out not just the attacker but their entire crew. Her assassins became feared for their efficiency, sometimes arriving on motorcycles, firing silenced weapons, and vanishing into traffic before police could react. But this relentless campaign of retaliation took a toll. Each killing invited another, each victory sowed the seeds of future conflict. The cycle of violence was spinning out of control, and even those within Griselda's organization began to worry about the direction things were headed. Some whispered that she was becoming too reckless, that her decisions were fueled by paranoia rather than strategy. Her paranoia was indeed growing. She trusted fewer people, often rotating her lieutenants and testing their loyalty. She reportedly kept a hit list, a ledger of enemies, real or perceived, that she planned to eliminate. This list grew longer as the years went by, and those who found themselves on it rarely survived. At the same time, law enforcement was becoming more organized. The DEA, working alongside the FBI and local Miami police, created task forces specifically focused on dismantling the networks responsible for the city's drug epidemic. Surveillance operations tracked Griselda's movements, phone taps monitored her associates, and informants were quietly recruited from within her network. Some of these informants were motivated by fear, others by money, and still others by the hope of escaping the life they were trapped in. Whatever their reasons, their information allowed authorities to piece together a clearer picture of Griselda's operation. Step by step, they began to tighten the noose. Griselda's personal life, too, began to unravel. Her relationships were marked by betrayal and bloodshed, and some of the men closest to her ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. Even her own lieutenants began to fall, either killed by rivals, arrested by authorities, or eliminated by Griselda herself when she suspected disloyalty. The stress of constant war and constant vigilance began to show. Those who saw her during this period recalled that she was more tense, more suspicious, her temper quicker to ignite. She was still formidable, still feared, but there was a sense that the walls were closing in. The most devastating blow, however, came from within her own world. As the Medellín cartel rose to power in Colombia, its leaders began to consolidate control over cocaine production and exportation. They were willing to work with Griselda for a time, but they also saw her as a liability, too violent, too unpredictable, too visible. Some accounts suggest that Medellín leaders quietly sanctioned attempts to remove her from power, either by assassination or by cutting off her supply of cocaine. This external pressure forced Griselda into even more desperate measures. She increased security, escalated her attacks on rivals, and sought to eliminate anyone who could challenge her authority. Miami's murder rate continued to climb, and her name became synonymous with the chaos. For the ordinary citizens of Miami, it felt as though the city had been taken hostage by an invisible force. The violence was no longer something that happened in the shadows, it was happening in shopping malls, on highways, in residential neighborhoods. Parents feared letting their children play outside. Business owners worried about stray bullets finding their way through store windows. And through it all, Griselda pressed forward. In her mind, retreat was not an option. The only way to survive was to fight harder, to strike first, to make sure that anyone who threatened her was erased from the picture entirely. But each act of violence brought her closer to the one enemy she could not outshoot, the law. Federal prosecutors were building cases, grand juries were convening, and investigators were sharing intelligence across agencies. The pressure was no longer coming only from rivals, it was coming from the United States government itself. Imagine her in this moment, pacing the marble floors of one of her mansions, her face tense, her mind racing. The phone rings constantly, reports of shipments, reports of killings, reports of new threats. Outside, her bodyguards watch the gates, guns at the ready. Inside, the Queen of Miami's cocaine empire is fighting a war on all fronts against rivals, against betrayal, against the inevitability of justice. It was a battle she could not win forever. And soon, the moment would come when all the power, all the money, all the fear she had cultivated would no longer be enough to protect her. The beginning of the end had arrived. The next chapter of her story would not be about expanding her empire, it would be about trying to hold it together as it began to crumble, piece by bloody piece. The early 1980s in Miami were soaked in blood. The city had already been transformed by the cocaine boom, but now it felt as if it were teetering on the edge of collapse. Every week brought new headlines, shootings in broad daylight, bodies found in cars, high-speed chases that ended in fiery crashes. And behind so much of this chaos, investigators believed, was the iron will of one woman, Griselda Blanco. Her empire was under siege. Rivals were multiplying, each one eager to take a piece of her fortune. Cuban gangs, Colombian competitors, and independent operators all saw an opportunity to challenge her dominance. But Griselda had no intention of yielding ground. To her, every challenge was an insult, and every insult was answered with bullets. Her sicarios, assassins trained to kill quickly and vanish, became the most feared force in Miami. They struck without warning, sometimes in crowded streets, sometimes in restaurants, sometimes at traffic lights. Motorcycle drive-bys became their signature, two men riding in tandem, one steering, the other unleashing a hail of gunfire before disappearing into the maze of city streets. These killings were not just retribution, they were strategy. Griselda believed that terror was the most effective way to maintain control. If a rival saw what happened to someone who defied her, they might think twice before making the same mistake. And for a while, it worked. Her name kept her enemies in line, at least long enough for her to continue moving shipments and counting profits. But violence breeds violence. Each assassination sparked a retaliation, and soon Miami became a war zone. The murder rate soared to unprecedented levels, in some years doubling the national average, and law enforcement struggled to keep up. Shootings erupted at gas stations, outside malls, even in front of schools. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire, further shocking a city that had once been known for its beaches and retirees. The Dadeland Mall massacre had been the opening salvo, but now it was just one of many such events. Police reports read like lists of battles, each one more brazen than the last. Cars were found riddled with bullets, their windshields shattered, their seats soaked with blood. Homes were invaded, businesses torched. Miami was no longer just a hub for cocaine, it was a battlefield. Griselda's paranoia grew to match the escalating violence. She increased her security, surrounding herself with bodyguards who followed her everywhere. She stopped trusting even some of her most loyal lieutenants, rotating her inner circle and testing them constantly. Anyone who showed even the slightest sign of disloyalty risked becoming the next target. Her personal life mirrored the brutality of her public one. Allegedly, some of her lovers and former business partners met their end at her order. Stories circulated that she had killed or had killed anyone she suspected of betrayal, regardless of how close they had once been to her. Even family was not immune to her wrath if she believed they had crossed her. And yet, for all the violence, the money continued to flow. Each shipment of cocaine brought in millions, and each successful run seemed to harden her resolve. She was determined to hold on to her empire no matter the cost. Some say she took pleasure in outsmarting both her rivals and the law, as though the danger itself had become part of the thrill. But cracks were beginning to show. The Medellín cartel, which was consolidating power back in Colombia, began to view Griselda as a liability. Her constant wars in Miami were attracting too much attention, bringing heat not just on her but on the entire network of traffickers. There were whispers that the cartel bosses wanted her out of the way permanently. At the same time, U.S. law enforcement was tightening its grip. Task forces dedicated to dismantling her network were making progress, flipping lower-level operatives into informants and seizing larger shipments of cocaine. Each bust cost Griselda money and, worse, trust. She became increasingly volatile, lashing out at anyone she suspected of weakness. The bloodbath years took a toll on everyone involved. Miami's morgues overflowed with the dead, and its jails filled with those caught in the crossfire of this war for power. Detectives worked around the clock, following leads, trying to piece together a case that could bring down the godmother once and for all. Yet Griselda remained a step ahead for now. She shifted locations constantly, using safe houses and trusted hideouts. Her assassins kept her rivals too frightened to make bold moves. And though her network was bleeding from the pressure, she held it together with the same combination of fear and charisma that had made her a queen. Still, the atmosphere was becoming unbearable. Even those who had once been fiercely loyal began to waver. Some fled Miami, hoping to escape the cycle of violence. Others quietly turned to the authorities, trading information for immunity. The net was closing in, even if Griselda refused to see it. Imagine her during this time, sitting in a dimly lit living room late at night, a pistol on the table beside her, listening to a trusted lieutenant whisper details of the latest attack. Her expression is unreadable, no sign of fear, no sign of hesitation, only the cold calculation of someone who knows exactly what must be done next. Another name goes on her list. Another life will be taken by morning. But no empire, no matter how fearsome, can survive a war on all fronts forever. The violence that had kept her in power was now drawing law enforcement closer every day. And soon, there would be no place left to hide. The bloodbath years had been Griselda's way of proving that she was still in control, still the most dangerous figure in Miami. But in the process, she had made too many enemies, shed too much blood, and drawn too much attention. The stage was now set for the next act in her story, one where the hunter would become the hunted, and where the woman who once seemed untouchable would finally face the full weight of justice. By the mid-1980s, Griselda Blanco was no longer just a name whispered in Miami's underworld, she was at the very top of the DEA's most wanted list. Her network had been connected to hundreds of murders, thousands of kilos of cocaine, and billions of dollars in illicit profits. She was the beating heart of the cocaine pipeline between Colombia and the United States, and federal authorities had made it their mission to bring her down. The Drug Enforcement Administration, working in tandem with the FBI and local Miami police, formed specialized task forces whose sole purpose was to dismantle her operation. These were not ordinary investigations. They involved months, even years, of painstaking surveillance, wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations. Agents tracked her shipments, monitored her associates, and slowly pieced together the vast, intricate puzzle that was her empire. Imagine the scene inside a DEA field office, a map of Miami on the wall, dotted with pins and red string tracing routes and connections. Photos of Griselda and her lieutenants taped up like a rogues gallery. Agents hunched over desks late into the night, poring over ledgers, phone records, and surveillance photos. The godmother had become an obsession, a specter haunting every briefing, every late-night strategy session. But bringing her down was no easy task. Griselda was as careful as she was ruthless. She rarely spoke on the phone, preferring face-to-face meetings where nothing could be recorded. She rotated her safe houses constantly, traveled with heavy security, and used layers of intermediaries to shield herself from direct involvement in transactions. This meant that law enforcement had to chip away at her empire piece by piece. They targeted her couriers first, the women who smuggled cocaine into the country using her innovative methods. Some were caught at airports, sweating under the scrutiny of customs agents. Others were arrested during raids on stash houses, found surrounded by cash and product. These arrests provided critical leverage. Faced with long prison sentences, many of the couriers agreed to cooperate. They gave names, routes, and details of operations, slowly revealing how Griselda's network functioned. Each piece of testimony was like a thread, and when investigators pulled enough of them together, a clearer picture of the web she had spun began to emerge. Wiretaps became another crucial tool. Although Griselda was cautious, her associates were sometimes careless, and phone conversations captured by federal agents revealed orders, coded messages, and discussions of shipments. Every intercepted call was logged, translated, and added to the growing mountain of evidence against her. Meanwhile, undercover agents infiltrated parts of her network, posing as buyers or middlemen, gathering intelligence while risking their lives in the process. These operations were dangerous. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, and an undercover agent could end up dead. But the risk was deemed necessary to get close enough to someone as insulated as Griselda. Back in Colombia, the U.S. government applied pressure on officials to crack down on suppliers feeding her network. International cooperation increased, and Colombian authorities began seizing labs, arresting pilots, and disrupting shipments. Each disruption cost Griselda money, creating further strain on her already volatile empire. The investigations also focused on following the money. Griselda's fortune was so vast that laundering it all had become a logistical nightmare, and every dollar left a trail. Agents traced bank deposits, real estate transactions, and car purchases, connecting them back to her organization. This financial evidence was just as damning as the cocaine seizures, proving that her wealth could not have come from any legitimate source. As the pressure mounted, Griselda's paranoia deepened. She became more reclusive, surrounding herself with even tighter security and limiting her interactions to a handful of trusted lieutenants. But even within that inner circle, cracks began to form. Some of her closest associates, fearing for their own lives, turned informant. Their testimonies provided prosecutors with first-hand accounts of murders, smuggling routes, and Griselda's direct involvement in key decisions. The net was closing. Federal prosecutors built a case that included not just drug trafficking but murder charges, a rare and risky move intended to ensure she would never escape justice. Grand juries were convened, indictments prepared, and warrants issued. For all her cunning, Griselda could not outrun the inevitable forever. She had been a ghost for years, a figure the authorities could never quite pin down, but now the trap was set. Every safe house was under watch, every associate under suspicion, every move she made tracked by someone, somewhere. Imagine the tension in those final months before her capture, DEA agents sitting in unmarked cars outside her properties, radios crackling softly as they waited for the order to move. Helicopters ready to deploy, SWAT teams standing by, prosecutors pacing in their offices, double-checking warrants. The sense of anticipation was electric, as though the entire city was holding its breath. And through it all, Griselda remained outwardly calm. To those who saw her during this time, she was still the same composed figure, still giving orders, still running her empire. Perhaps she believed she could outsmart the law as she had so many times before. Perhaps she could not imagine a world in which she was not in control. But the walls had closed in too tightly. The hunter had finally become the hunted, and there was nowhere left to run. When the arrest finally came, it was as decisive and well-planned as the operations Griselda herself had orchestrated. Agents moved in quickly, surrounding her hideout and taking her into custody before she could react. For the first time in years, the most feared woman in Miami's underworld was in handcuffs. The news of her arrest spread like wildfire. Newspapers splashed her mugshot across their front pages, television anchors spoke of the queenpin of cocaine finally being brought to justice, and Miami breathed a cautious sigh of relief. But even as she sat in a holding cell, Griselda Blanco remained a figure of both fear and fascination. The next chapter would be fought not in the streets but in the courts, a battle where her life story would be laid bare and where the full weight of her past would finally catch up with her. The day Griselda Blanco was arrested marked the end of an era for Miami. The queen who had ruled the cocaine trade with fear and precision was suddenly behind bars, her freedom stripped away as easily as a pair of handcuffs clicking shut. For law enforcement, it was a victory years in the making, a moment that symbolized progress in a city drowning under the weight of drug violence. But for Griselda, it was the beginning of a new kind of war. She was taken into custody without the spectacle some might have expected. There were no wild shootouts, no desperate attempts at escape, just a swift, coordinated raid that caught her off guard. The woman who had evaded justice for so long now sat in a windowless interrogation room, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, her expression as unreadable as ever. Even in custody, she exuded a kind of cold authority. Agents who were present during her arrest later described her as calm, almost regal, as though she had merely been inconvenienced rather than defeated. She answered questions selectively, never giving more than she had to, and always with an air that suggested she still believed she was in control. Her trial became a spectacle. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as they tried to capture the face of the woman dubbed the Cocaine Godmother. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out the story of her rise to power, her smuggling network, and the trail of violence she left in her wake. They presented evidence from years of surveillance, phone records, financial transactions, eyewitness testimony from former associates who had turned informants. One by one, members of her organization took the stand, their faces pale as they recounted how Griselda had ordered murders, planned shipments, and run her empire with an iron fist. Some testified out of fear, hoping their cooperation would spare them prison time. Others seemed eager to distance themselves from her legacy, painting her as the mastermind behind every drop of blood spilled in Miami's drug wars. The testimony was chilling. There were stories of rivals gunned down in shopping malls, of couriers executed for stealing, of even her closest partners falling victim to her wrath. The jury listened in silence as the picture of a woman both brilliant and brutal emerged, a woman who had built an empire from nothing but had done so at the cost of countless lives. For Griselda, the courtroom became a stage. She dressed immaculately, carried herself with poise, and seemed to relish the attention. Some observers noted that she rarely showed emotion, even when confronted with evidence of her crimes. If she was shaken by the accusations, she did not let it show. To many, she still seemed like the godmother, unbowed, unbroken, and defiant. But outside the courtroom, her empire was collapsing. Without her direct control, her network began to fracture. Rivals moved in to seize territory, shipments were lost, and lieutenants either fled or were killed. The Medellín cartel tightened its grip on the U.S. cocaine market, leaving little room for independent operators like Griselda's crew. Her arrest also emboldened law enforcement to go after the remnants of her operation with renewed vigor. Stash houses were raided, assets seized, and dozens of her associates arrested. The organization that had once seemed untouchable was dismantled piece by piece until little remained but the legend of its former power. Griselda faced multiple charges: drug trafficking, conspiracy, and even murder. Prosecutors hoped to put her away for life, using the testimony of her former allies to build an airtight case. But Griselda was nothing if not resourceful. She hired top defense attorneys, fought every charge aggressively, and looked for weaknesses in the prosecution's case. One of the most dramatic moments of the legal proceedings came when allegations surfaced that a hitman had been plotting to kill witnesses who were set to testify against her. Whether or not Griselda was behind this plan was never definitively proven, but the rumors were enough to add yet another layer of tension to the already high-stakes trial. Ultimately, she was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to decades in prison. The verdict was celebrated by law enforcement as a major victory, a sign that even the most powerful criminals could be brought to justice. For Miami, it was the symbolic closing of a dark chapter, though the scars left by the cocaine wars would linger for years. For Griselda, prison was a new battlefield. She had been a queen, accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. Now she was just another inmate, subject to the routines and restrictions of the system she had spent her life evading. And yet, even behind bars, she found ways to exert influence. There were whispers that she continued to run aspects of her business from prison, using loyal contacts on the outside to send messages and enforce her will. Some even claimed that murders were ordered at her direction while she was incarcerated, a testament to how deep her reach still was, even when stripped of her freedom. But the world outside was changing. The Medellín and Cali cartels were locked in their own wars, new players were rising, and the cocaine market was shifting. Griselda's time as the dominant figure in Miami's drug scene was over. Her empire had been dismantled, her rivals had taken what was left, and her legend was now being rewritten in news articles, books, and television documentaries. Picture her in those early years of incarceration, sitting in a stark prison cell, the sound of metal doors clanging in the distance, her mind undoubtedly replaying the choices that had led her there. Perhaps she still believed she could find a way back, that one day she might walk free and reclaim what she had lost. Or perhaps she already understood that this was the price of her ambition, the inevitable end for someone who had ruled through fear and blood. The trial and conviction were not just the end of her freedom, they were the end of her era. Miami had changed forever under her reign, but now the city would try to heal, to rebuild, to move on from the violence that had defined a generation. And yet, even as she sat in prison, the story of Griselda Blanco was far from over. There were still chapters left to write, chapters of survival, of reflection, and of the haunting legacy she would leave behind. Prison was a new world for Griselda Blanco, a world with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own dangers. For a woman who had spent years commanding armies of smugglers and assassins, the adjustment must have felt surreal. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers of her Miami mansions were replaced by concrete walls and the echo of clanging metal doors. The smell of perfume and cigar smoke gave way to the sterile scent of bleach and institutional food. But Griselda was nothing if not adaptable. She had survived the slums of Medellín, outmaneuvered rivals, and built an empire from nothing. Prison, in a strange way, was just another battlefield, and she was determined not to lose this one. From the moment she arrived, she carried herself with the same quiet authority she had always possessed. Other inmates watched her carefully, curious about the woman whose name had been splashed across newspapers and television screens. Some feared her, others admired her, and a few sought her protection. In prison, as on the streets, reputation was everything, and Griselda's reputation entered before she did. She quickly learned the rhythms of prison life, the wake-up calls, the meal times, the yard hours. But she did not merely exist within the system, she began to bend it to her advantage. Guards and staff noticed her composure, her ability to command respect without raising her voice. Over time, she built a network even behind bars, forging alliances, exchanging favors, and ensuring that she remained a figure of influence. There were whispers that her power extended far beyond the prison walls. Investigators and journalists later claimed that she continued to run parts of her organization from her cell, issuing orders through coded letters, phone calls, and loyal visitors. Some even alleged that murders were carried out at her direction during this period, a chilling reminder that the Cocaine Godmother's reach had not been completely severed. But the woman who had once moved through Miami like a shadow was now confined to a space no larger than a walk-in closet. Time slowed in prison. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. For someone who had lived her life at a relentless pace, always planning, always calculating, this forced stillness must have been disorienting. Perhaps it was in this stillness that reflection began. Those who encountered her in prison sometimes spoke of her as quieter, more contemplative. She spent time reading, writing, and speaking with chaplains. Whether this was genuine repentance or simply another form of strategy is impossible to say, but it was clear that prison had changed the tempo of her life. Her children remained a constant concern. Some of them were already entangled in the very world she had built, and from behind bars, she tried to exert influence over their lives. She worried for their safety, knowing that the enemies she had made might target them as a way of striking at her. Letters from this period suggest a woman who was still fiercely maternal, still trying to protect what remained of her family, even as the empire she had built crumbled outside. Griselda's health, too, began to decline during her incarceration. The years of stress, the constant tension, and perhaps the weight of her past took their toll. She was hospitalized more than once, suffering from high blood pressure and other ailments that reminded her she was no longer the young woman who had once run through Medellín's alleys with nothing to lose. Despite these challenges, she remained a figure of fascination. Journalists sought interviews, filmmakers proposed documentaries, and law enforcement officials occasionally spoke of her case as one of their most significant victories. The public remained captivated by the idea of a woman who had risen so high and fallen so far, and yet still seemed larger than life, even in a prison uniform. Inside, she continued to navigate the delicate balance of survival. Prison politics could be just as dangerous as cartel politics, and she had to maintain alliances, manage rivalries, and keep her guard up at all times. But where others might have been broken by the experience, Griselda endured. Imagine her in those long, quiet nights, lying on a narrow prison cot, staring up at the ceiling, the sound of distant footsteps echoing down the hall. Perhaps she thought of Miami, of the parties, the mansions, the money stacked in closets. Perhaps she thought of Medellín, of the barefoot girl who had stolen to survive, who had dreamed of escaping the poverty that threatened to swallow her whole. Prison may have stripped her of her empire, but it had not erased her story. If anything, it deepened her legend. She became a symbol of ambition, of fear, of the high price of power. To some, she was a cautionary tale. To others, she remained an icon of defiance, a woman who had played in a man's world and refused to bow, even when the world finally caught her. Years passed. Appeals were filed and denied. Some of her charges were dropped or consolidated, but her sentence remained long. The world outside moved on, the Medellín cartel rose and fell, new players took over the cocaine trade, Miami changed, its skyline growing taller, its streets somewhat safer. And still Griselda waited, aging behind bars, watching the empire she had once ruled fade into history. By the time her release date approached, she had spent nearly 2 decades in prison. She had entered as one of the most feared figures in organized crime. She would leave as a woman in her 60s, no longer at the center of the world's attention, but still carrying the weight of her name. Her prison years were both punishment and transformation. They stripped her of her throne, but they also gave her something she had not had in years, time to think, to reckon with what she had built and what it had cost. And when she finally stepped back into the world, she would face a new challenge, living with the ghosts of her past, in a Colombia that had changed as much as she had. Behind every empire lies a family, and for Griselda Blanco, her children were both her pride and her vulnerability. Throughout her life, she had been many things: a smuggler, a queenpin, a fugitive, a prisoner. But above all, she was a mother. Those who knew her often said that she loved her sons fiercely, perhaps even obsessively. She wanted for them the things she had never had: wealth, security, respect. But the world she built for them was not one of safety, it was one of blood and bullets. Griselda had 4 sons: Dixon, Uber, Osvaldo, and Michael Corleone Blanco, the last named after the fictional Mafia boss from The Godfather. Each of them, in one way or another, was pulled into the gravity of her empire. It was impossible not to be. Cocaine funded their homes, their cars, their very way of life. And with that money came danger that shadowed them everywhere. For years, she tried to keep them close, to raise them within the world she controlled. She taught them loyalty, discipline, and the rules of survival. To some, it seemed as though she was grooming them to follow in her footsteps, to inherit the throne she had carved out of blood and fear. And in many ways, they did. Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo were drawn into the drug trade as they grew older, running operations of their own and helping to manage the business while their mother was imprisoned. But the life they had inherited was not one that offered happy endings. One by one, tragedy claimed them. Dixon was the first to go gunned down in Colombia in what many believed was a cartel-ordered hit. The news reached Griselda while she was still behind bars, and though she rarely showed emotion, those who saw her that day said she was shaken. Losing a son was more than just a personal tragedy, it was a crack in the armor she had spent her life building. Uber met a similar fate, assassinated on the streets of Medellín. The pattern was becoming clear. Her enemies had found the surest way to hurt her, and they were exploiting it. Each death was both a message and a wound, reminding her that the past could not be escaped. Osvaldo's death came not long after, yet another violent end, another coffin, another reminder that her empire had never offered true protection. By the time the third son was gone, Griselda was no longer the powerful queen of Miami, but a grieving mother counting the bodies of her children. Only Michael Corleone Blanco survived into adulthood. He was still young when his brothers were killed, and by the time Griselda was released from prison, he had grown into a man trying to find his own way in the shadow of her legacy. In interviews years later, Michael would speak of the trauma of growing up as the son of the cocaine godmother, the constant fear, the sudden violence, the sense that danger was always waiting just around the corner. Griselda's love for her children had always been fierce, but it was a love expressed in the only language she truly knew, power and control. She had tried to build a world where they would never know the poverty she had endured, but the price of that world was paid in blood. In seeking to give them everything, she had also given them enemies who would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The deaths of her sons must have weighed heavily on her during her final years in prison. Perhaps in the quiet of her cell she replayed the choices she had made, the killings she had ordered, the wars she had started, the rivals she had angered. Perhaps she wondered whether any of it had been worth it, whether the money, the mansions, the power had been worth the lives of the boys she had once held in her arms. It is said that grief changes people, reshapes them from the inside out. For Griselda, who had always been defined by her strength and defiance, the loss of 3 of her sons may have been the one thing capable of softening her edges. When she was finally released from prison, observers noted that she seemed quieter, more subdued, a shadow of the fierce figure she had once been. This section of her story is not just about crime and punishment, it is about the human cost of a life lived at war with the world. Griselda was not the only one who paid the price for her choices. Her sons, her associates, even innocent bystanders had all been caught in the crossfire of her ambition. Imagine her sitting alone after receiving news of yet another son's death, the prison around her silent except for the distant sound of keys rattling on a guard's belt. Perhaps she held the letter in her hand, reading it again and again, as if willing the words to change. But they never did. Death had come for her children just as it had come for so many others in her story, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. These losses also reinforced a truth she had always known, that power could not protect those you loved forever. The empire she had built had crumbled, but its enemies still remembered, still sought revenge, still found ways to collect the debts they believed were owed. By the time Griselda left prison, she was a woman marked by grief. The godmother who had once inspired terror now carried a quieter burden, the knowledge that her family had been shattered by the very life she had chosen. And yet, her story was not finished. There were still years ahead of her, years in which she would attempt to live quietly, to stay out of the spotlight, to simply exist. But for someone like Griselda, peace was always going to be elusive. After nearly 2 decades behind bars, Griselda Blanco was finally released. It was 2004, and the world she stepped back into was not the same one she had left. Miami had changed. The cocaine wars that had once turned the city into a battlefield were largely over. New traffickers had risen and fallen, and the Medellín and Cali cartels that had defined an era had been dismantled. But Griselda herself had changed, too. She was no longer the feared godmother striding through Miami nightclubs, issuing orders that could end lives with a single nod. She was in her early 60s now, her health fragile, her figure more frail than formidable. Prison had aged her, slowed her, and perhaps, just perhaps, softened her. Upon her release, U.S. authorities wasted no time in deporting her back to Colombia. She boarded a plane under heavy escort, leaving behind the country where she had once ruled like a queen, returning to the land where her journey had first begun. Colombia in 2004 was also a country transformed. The days of Medellín as the epicenter of the cocaine trade were gone, its most infamous son, Pablo Escobar, long dead. Security forces had reasserted control over many parts of the country, and though the drug trade still thrived in different forms, it was no longer the wild, lawless landscape it had once been. Griselda settled quietly in Medellín, the city that had shaped her, scarred her, and ultimately sent her on the path to becoming the cocaine godmother. Those who saw her during this period described a woman who kept to herself, who no longer sought the spotlight. She lived in relative anonymity, rarely appearing in public, and when she did, she was said to be almost unrecognizable from the glamorous figure she had once been. Imagine her walking through a quiet neighborhood market, a shawl draped over her shoulders, blending into the crowd. No entourage, no convoy of armed guards, just an older woman buying food, nodding politely to vendors, her past known only to those who dared whisper it. Some said she had retired completely from the drug trade, content to live out her remaining years in peace. Others whispered that she still maintained quiet connections, that she still received visitors who brought her news from the underworld, that she could never truly let go of the life that had defined her. Her surviving son, Michael Corleone Blanco, later claimed that his mother dreamed of starting over, perhaps even going legitimate. She had spoken of opening a business, of living a quiet life surrounded by her grandchildren. It was as if, after decades of violence and bloodshed, she longed for something simple, something ordinary, a kind of peace she had never known. And yet, peace was always going to be complicated for someone like Griselda. She carried with her a lifetime of enemies, debts unpaid, grudges that had never been forgotten. For all her attempts to live quietly, she remained a symbol, and symbols are not easily allowed to fade away. Her days in Medellín reportedly passed in a strange mixture of routine and vigilance. She went to church, visited family, and kept mostly to herself. But those who knew her said she never fully let her guard down. She still looked over her shoulder. She still avoided speaking too freely with strangers. She still knew that danger could come at any moment. Perhaps she believed that enough time had passed, that her name no longer carried the same weight it once had, that the world had moved on and left her behind. And perhaps she hoped that by staying quiet, she could simply disappear into the city that had once birthed her legend. But destiny, it seemed, had one final act in store for Griselda Blanco. Even as she tried to live in the shadows, rumors of her presence circulated. Old enemies remembered. Younger generations of criminals, who had grown up hearing stories of La Madrina, were curious, some in awe, some resentful, some perhaps seeking revenge for relatives who had been killed during her reign. The city had changed, yes, but the streets still had a long memory. And in Medellín, memories are often settled with bullets. Imagine her in those final years, sitting on a porch as the sun sets behind the mountains, the sound of children playing in the distance, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth. She is older now, quieter, but her mind is still sharp. She must know, deep down, that she is living on borrowed time. For a woman who had built an empire out of violence, who had sent so many others to their graves, the thought of her own mortality must have been a constant companion. And yet, she continued to live cautiously, deliberately, as though each day was both a gift and a countdown. This was the calm before the storm, the quiet chapter that felt almost like a redemption story, but one that could not last. For Griselda Blanco, there would be no peaceful retirement, no quiet passing in her sleep. The life she had lived would not allow such an ending. Soon, the city that had made her would come back to claim her. It was a quiet afternoon in Medellín in September 2012 when death finally came for Griselda Blanco. By then, she had been out of prison for several years, living a life that, at least on the surface, seemed calm and uneventful. She was 69 years old, a grandmother, and far removed from the neon-lit Miami nights where her legend had been forged. But the past has a way of catching up, and for Griselda, that past arrived with the sound of a motorcycle. She had gone to a butcher shop that day, a small, ordinary errand. There was nothing unusual about it. She entered the shop quietly, purchased meat for her family, and stepped outside. Perhaps for a moment, she felt almost normal, like just another woman running errands in the late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow across the street. The city seemed peaceful, deceptively so. And then came the motorcycle. Two men rode up, just as her own assassins had done countless times in Miami decades earlier. One stayed the bike, the other raised a gun. Witnesses later said it was quick, almost shockingly quiet. Two shots rang out, precise, deliberate. The bullets struck Griselda in the head, and she fell to the pavement outside the shop, her body crumpling as shoppers screamed and scattered. The men on the motorcycle sped away into the Medellín traffic, leaving behind nothing but silence and the echo of gunfire. It was a killing carried out with airy efficiency, the kind of assassination Griselda herself had perfected and popularized. In a grim twist of fate, the woman who had invented the method of motorcycle drive-by hits had been killed by the very tactic she had unleashed upon the world. The butcher shop killing made headlines across Colombia and around the globe. News outlets reported her death with a mixture of shock and grim fascination. For years, she had lived quietly, almost forgotten by the wider world, and now she was back in the spotlight one last time, not as a fugitive, not as a prisoner, but as a casualty. For some, her death was a long-awaited reckoning. There were those who had lost brothers, sons, and fathers during the blood-soaked reign of the Cocaine Godmother, and to them, her murder was justice served. For others, it was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in the history of organized crime that had reshaped cities and nations. Her body lay on the sidewalk for a time, covered by a white sheet, as curious onlookers gathered. Some recognized her immediately, others were stunned to learn that the older woman who had been shot was once one of the most feared figures in the criminal underworld. In a strange way, her death was almost poetic, not drawn out, not quiet, but sudden, violent, and public. Just as her life had been. Imagine the scene, the street still shimmering with the last light of the afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of blood and gunpowder, the hum of traffic continuing as if nothing had happened. A woman who had once commanded empires, who had terrified an entire city, now lay still on the ground, the world moving on without her. Her killers were never definitively identified. Some said it was revenge from old enemies, others speculated that it was the work of new traffickers who wanted to ensure that the godmother could never return to power. Some even believed it might have been an inside job, someone close to her settling a score. In the end, no one was ever brought to justice for her assassination, and the mystery only deepened her legend. Her funeral was a subdued affair compared to the extravagance of her life. Family members and a few loyal friends attended, standing by as her coffin was lowered into the ground. There were no grand displays, no lavish processions, just a quiet burial in a Medellín cemetery, where her body was laid to rest near the city that had first shaped her destiny. For Michael Corleone Blanco, her surviving son, the loss was personal and profound. He had spent years trying to build a life beyond the shadow of his mother's empire, but her death brought back everything, the memories, the dangers, the legacy he could never escape. Griselda's assassination marked the final act in a story that had spanned decades, continents, and countless lives. It was the end of the Cocaine Godmother, but not the end of her influence. Her name still carried weight, still stirred fear and fascination, still appeared in books, documentaries, and whispers in the underworld. Her life had been one of extremes, extreme poverty, extreme power, extreme violence, and her death was no different. She had always lived on her own terms, and though the final choice was not hers, there was something darkly fitting about the way it happened. Picture that Medellín street after the crowd dispersed, the blood washed away by evening rain, leaving behind only the memory of what had occurred. Somewhere in the city, the men on the motorcycle melted back into anonymity, their task complete. And somewhere, perhaps, the ghosts of those Griselda had ordered killed might have been waiting, watching, as if to say that the circle had finally closed. The story of her death reverberated far beyond Medellín. In Miami, old detectives who had once hunted her spoke to reporters, reflecting on the woman who had terrorized their city. Some said they felt relief. Others admitted to a strange kind of respect for an adversary who had been clever enough to evade them for so long, powerful enough to change the face of their city forever. Griselda Blanco was gone, but the myth of the Cocaine Godmother was now immortal. And as the sun set on Medellín that day, it felt as though the city itself exhaled, finally free of the shadow she had cast for so many years. Even in death, Griselda Blanco refused to fade quietly into history. Her assassination in 2012 had closed the chapter on her life, but it opened a new one, a chapter of myth-making, documentaries, and a fascination that only grew stronger with time. The Cocaine Godmother had become something more than a person. She was now a legend, a symbol of both the heights and the horrors of power. Almost immediately after her death, media outlets around the world revisited her story. Newspapers published retrospectives, detailing her rise from a poor girl in Medellín to one of the most powerful drug traffickers in history. Television programs ran specials, piecing together her bloody reign in Miami and the trail of bodies she left behind. The name Griselda Blanco once again became front-page news, not as a fugitive, not as a prisoner, but as an icon of a dark and violent era. Documentaries soon followed. Filmmakers were captivated by the dramatic arc of her life, the poverty, the ambition, the rise to power, the war for Miami, the prison years, and finally the poetic symmetry of her death by motorcycle hit. Each documentary tried to peel back the layers of the myth to reveal the woman beneath, yet somehow, the closer they looked, the more enigmatic she became. Pop culture, too, embraced her story. She was referenced in songs by major hip-hop artists, her name used as shorthand for female ruthlessness and power. Rappers compared themselves to Griselda as a way of signaling dominance and fearlessness, turning her into a symbol within a genre that often celebrates those who defy authority and rewrite the rules. Television series dramatized her life, exploring not just her crimes but her psychology, the unique position she held as a woman in a world ruled by men, and the way she weaponized that position to become even more dangerous. Actresses brought her to life on screen with performances that showed both her ferocity and her complexity, reminding audiences that behind every headline was a human being who loved, feared, and suffered. But fascination with Griselda was not just about glamour or crime story intrigue. Her life raised uncomfortable questions. Was she a feminist icon of sorts? A woman who smashed through the ceiling of a male-dominated underworld? Or was she simply a ruthless killer who left a trail of destruction? Could she be both a symbol of empowerment and a cautionary tale at the same time? Historians and criminologists debated her legacy. Some argued that she paved the way for the cartels that came after her, showing them that the cocaine trade could be scaled into a billion-dollar industry. Others contended that she was a liability, too violent and too visible, drawing unnecessary attention to a business that had thrived in the shadows. Even law enforcement veterans could not resist reflecting on her story. Detectives who had once hunted her admitted that she had been one of their most challenging adversaries. They spoke of her intelligence, her ability to outthink them, and the strange respect they felt for someone who had been able to evade capture for so long. Her name also lived on in Medellín and Miami, cities forever scarred by the years of bloodshed she helped unleash. In Medellín, she was spoken of with a mix of fear and pride, fear for the lives she had taken, pride that a woman from the barrios had risen so far. In Miami, her reign was remembered as both a nightmare and a turning point, a period that forced the city to confront the scale of the drug epidemic and ultimately transform itself. Even her surviving son, Michael Corleone Blanco, contributed to the mythos. He became a public figure in his own right, appearing in reality television shows and interviews where he spoke candidly about growing up as the son of the Cocaine Godmother. He shared stories of her toughness, her love for her family, and the weight of living under her shadow. In some ways, he became the guardian of her legacy, trying to humanize the woman who had been painted as a monster, while also acknowledging the damage she had done. There was something undeniably magnetic about Griselda's story. It combined all the elements of an epic tragedy: humble beginnings, meteoric rise, ruthless rule, devastating losses, and a violent, almost cinematic end. Listeners and viewers around the world were drawn to her narrative not just because it was thrilling, but because it offered a window into the extremes of human ambition and the price of power. Imagine someone watching a documentary about her late at night, the screen flickering in a dark room, hearing the narrator speak of her as both queen and killer. The images of Miami in the late 1970s, the shootouts, the luxury homes, the police raids, all of it playing like a film noir, with Griselda as both protagonist and villain. Her legacy remains complicated. She is celebrated in some circles, vilified in others. To some, she is a feminist trailblazer who refused to be controlled by men and carved her own empire in a world that tried to shut her out. To others, she is a symbol of the destruction wrought by the drug trade, a reminder of the lives lost and families shattered by cocaine's bloody journey. What cannot be denied is her impact. Griselda Blanco changed the way drugs were smuggled, distributed, and sold in the United States. She was a pioneer of methods still used today, and her business acumen set the stage for the billion-dollar cartels that followed. She also changed Miami forever, leaving behind a city that had to rebuild itself after years of chaos, a city that still carries the scars of her reign. Her story continues to fascinate because it forces us to confront the duality of power, how it can elevate and destroy, inspire and terrify, create and consume. The Cocaine Godmother may be gone, but her shadow still stretches across history, reminding us that every empire, no matter how fearsome, eventually meets its end. And yet, the legend of Griselda Blanco endures, as captivating now as it was when she walked the streets of Miami, a woman no one dared to cross. Every story has to end, even one as turbulent and bloody as Griselda Blanco's. Her life was a saga of contradictions, a tale of survival and ambition, of brilliance and brutality, of love and unimaginable loss. From the narrow alleys of Medellín to the glittering nightclubs of Miami, from the courtroom to the prison cell, and finally back to the streets of her hometown, her journey was nothing short of epic. And now, with her passing, we are left with the echoes of a life that reshaped the world around her. Reflecting on Griselda's story invites us to look beyond the headlines and the myth. It is tempting to see her as just a villain, a woman who flooded cities with cocaine, who ordered murders without hesitation, who turned Miami into a war zone. And those things are true. But she was also a human being, shaped by circumstances most of us can scarcely imagine. She was born into poverty so deep that crime may have felt like the only path forward. She learned early that the world was cruel, that power belonged to those willing to take it, and she lived by that lesson until the very end. In many ways, her life is a cautionary tale. It shows us what happens when ambition is pursued without limit, when fear becomes the foundation of power, when vengeance becomes a way of life. Her empire brought her riches and respect, but it also cost her everything: her freedom, her children, and ultimately her life. Power gave her the world, but it also made her a prisoner even before the bars of a jail cell closed around her. And yet, there is something undeniably compelling about her. Perhaps it is because she refused to be small, refused to accept the role that the world tried to give her. In a world ruled by men, she carved out a throne and sat on it defiantly, no matter the price. There is a dark kind of inspiration in her story, not because we should follow her path, but because it reminds us that strength can be found even in the most unlikely places. Griselda's death was the final punctuation mark on a life lived at full volume. And though the streets of Medellín have long since washed away the blood that was spilled that day, the memory of La Madrina lingers. Her story continues to be told in documentaries, in books, in television dramas, in songs. Each retelling adds a new layer to the legend, a new interpretation of who she was and what she represented. But as the lights fade on this story, we are left with quiet questions. Was Griselda a product of her environment, or did she choose her path freely? Was she a visionary who saw opportunity where others saw nothing, or was she simply a ruthless survivor whose brilliance was matched only by her capacity for cruelty? These questions may never have simple answers, and perhaps that is why her story continues to fascinate us. What we can say with certainty is that her life left a mark. Miami is not the same city it was before the cocaine wars, and the global drug trade still feels the ripple effects of the systems she helped create. The term cocaine cowboy became part of the cultural lexicon, a shorthand for an entire era of excess and violence. And in the center of it all stands Griselda Blanco, a woman who defined that era and, in many ways, was defined by it. As we close this chapter, imagine the streets of Miami now, quieter, safer, the neon lights glowing softly over calm waters. Imagine Medellín at dusk, the mountains standing watch as the city hums below. Somewhere, in the collective memory of these places, Griselda's shadow still lingers, a reminder of a time when one woman bent to cities to her will. And perhaps, as you listen to this story in the stillness of night, you can let the noise of her world fade away. The gunfire, the sirens, the shouted orders, let them fall silent. What remains is a life that has ended, a reign that has passed, and a lesson about the price of power. Her story is both a warning and a meditation, that power built on fear is always fragile, that violence begets violence, and that no empire, no matter how ruthless, can last forever. In the end, we all meet the same fate. Griselda Blanco was called many things: La Madrina, the Cocaine Godmother, the Black Widow, the Queen of Cocaine. But in the end, she was simply human, flawed, fierce, and finite. And now, her story is complete. So as this long, dark journey comes to a close, take a deep breath and let it go. The streets are quiet now. The Queen has fallen. The story is over.